far from Germany, onto the wideness of the plains of America, where the wars were not between the same old enemies he was used to, but were over before he'd got there, the great dying finished, and the blood already soaked into the ground. Chapter 13. The Snake People. When Delphine had asked him the obvious question, Roy's answer often was, "I drink to fill the emptiness." Delphine hated that line. Once she pushed him backward into a chair and yelled, "Hey, I've got news for you. Everyone does everything to fill the emptiness." While it may or may not have been true, Roy was comforted to think that his personal emptiness was universal. He felt less special, especially when it came to the dark, fixed hole that his lost love had left in him. But he felt a kinship, too, with other empty souls. From then on, one of his favorite bottoms-up slogans was a toast to the great void. During the long sobriety that he enjoyed after Ava's death, he'd taken Delphine's remark as an earnest directive. Everything he'd done, he did to fill the emptiness. Unfortunately, nothing worked like alcohol. "Nothing can fill the ache of the abyss," he said one night to his singing cronies. The men were sitting on old crates and creaking chairs in the ruins of an arbor that grapevines had half pulled down with their quick-growing weight. Fidelis always kept them organized, singing song after song, practicing. When he was occupied elsewhere, as now, the men often drifted into gossip or even self-pitying monologues. "Nothing can fill the nothing," Roy went on lecturing, "except love or booze or a great religious impulse. And I ain't got Minnie's love anymore, or the lack of an imagination to believe in the God of the Lutherans or the Catholics, nor do I got the depth to invent my own rattletrap version of the Lord Almighty." Everyone nodded, but no one answered for fear of setting him off on some other open-ended, infinite topic. "Nothing," he said, pulling his nose. "God made schnapps for a reason and one reason only. He left a hole in us, yes. He left a hole when he molded us from the clay. A cup. And then he felt sorry for us and he gave us fermented spirits to pour in the cup. Why do you think they're called spirits?" He looked around fiercely. "Think about it." They all should have known that Roy was heading for a relapse. Gradually, first with small trickles of beer, and then in an increasingly fabulous wash, Roy proceeded to fill the emptiness again with his favorite substance. He often lied to his daughter about working with Step and a Half, when he was really swigging away down at the bums jungle or sitting on the back steps of the pool hall. He was not allowed inside anymore. Or he was somewhere else, anywhere that would have him, getting juiced to the gills. Hoping to keep Delphine unaware, as well as avoid another series of visits from the unruly dead, the drunk Roy stayed away from his house. The spirits of the piteous Chavers family left him alone as long as he avoided the scene of their undoing. He was still able to sober himself up for 2 or 3 days each week, and on those days he stayed with Delphine, and was perhaps overly solicitous. He cooked heavy breakfasts and washed his own clothing. He scrubbed floors. It was his absence and his homely industry then, an exact pattern she'd never known in him, that kept Delphine in the dark for such a long time. She only discovered the truth once she returned from Chicago and started to look for work. Delphine hurried over to Step and a Half's shop the next morning. Outside, on the skim of concrete in the beaten dirt of the entry, an arrangement of butter churns, their paddles worn by female hands, listed slightly one to the next. She stepped around old washtubs, an old iron mangle, chipped jars, and dented or bunged pots, eyed an array of gap-toothed rakes, dulled hoes, brooms worn to the binding of the straw. The spill of junk into the street, which Step and a Half didn't always bother to bring inside at night, was meant to entice customers. Instead, the stuff made a barrier that either tripped people or sent them off the walk into the street to skirt the mess. Delphine entered with the hope that she could have Tanta's old position, but she took a small step backward when the junk picker leaned across the scarred wood of the counter. "Tanta's old job? I gave her a job because I felt sorry for that bag of bones. Why is it you high and mighties from the butcher shop always come to me?" Delphine folded her arms. "Well, forget it then. You could sure use me around this place, but I'm not going to beg to sell your ratty old crap." "That's more like it." Step and a Half smiled to herself and put a toothpick in her mouth. Cigarettes were becoming scarcer. Expensive. The roll-your-own bags of Bull Durham made harsh smokes, and she'd started chewing toothpicks instead of lighting up around the precious fabrics, because the wools, especially, absorbed the stink. She began to shred the toothpick with her teeth. From time to time her eye opened wide to fix Delphine in a light of intrigue. At last she spoke. "You don't need the work. You should just get away from that damn old drunk. Leave him to pickle. You could go anywhere and get away from him. The whole damn town feels sorry for you." "What do you know about it?" Delphine was furious now. "I know plenty," said Stepanov. "I kicked him out of here just yesterday, soaked." "He's not drinking." "Your head's in the dirt. He's an old wino, Delphine. They do not change." "They do so," said Delphine. "He finally has changed. The pledge took this time. You should see him." "I did see him, and I smelled him, too." "Bullshit," said Delphine, although she knew she was hearing the truth. An immense dispirited darkness of mood caved on her as she took in the fact that she'd ignored the signs in Roy. Why was she such a realist in every other way, except when it came to her father? She left the store without saying another word, walked home and crawled into bed to catch up on the sleep she'd missed out on in Chicago. When she woke, the cloud descended again. Heavy-brained and still groggy, she stumbled to the kitchen to cook herself a pair of sunny-side-up eggs. "So the old man fell off again," she mumbled to the spatula. Worry over her father quickly changed to the exhausting old fury. "What the hell do I even care for?" she fumed, forking the eggs up straight from the pan into her mouth. Her lonely greed and nervousness embarrassed her. She put the fork down and vowed, "I won't go looking for him. I'll check on Marcus instead." With resolute haste, she made up a quick pot of the same dumpling soup Marcus had survived on after his near burial. She wrapped the pot of soup in a towel and drove to Waldvogel's. On the way there, she realized that she had only $10 left to her name, and, now that she couldn't count on Roy for a contribution, no prospect of paying end-of-the-month bills. If she didn't find another job within the week, she'd sell the car, she decided. The prospect steadied her panic. There was a rich smell of garlic in the air of the shop. Fidelis must be mixing up a batch of Italian sausage, Delphine thought, and then she began to notice things. The cream was not put away. "Watch that," she pointed as Franz came out of the side cooler. "It'll spoil." Nobody had cleaned the fingerprint smudges off the case's glass front. Delphine grabbed a rag and did it herself, then threw the rag down. "Where's Marcus?" she asked. Franz pointed to the back rooms, and she left all that was distressingly undone in the shop and went back there, concerned to find that Marcus was still in bed, but glad at least he wasn't any worse. Of course he hadn't changed out of the clothes he'd worn to Chicago, even down to the same socks. God, those stink. Delphine coaxed the socks off his feet. "I feel good. I just can't stand up. I fall over." Marcus laughed. He was a giddily cheerful patient, glad to be home. Delphine was drawn to stay with him. His face was eager, his pale, peach-bright hair stuck every which way in bent curls. Delphine rummaged through the meager supply of clean clothing, found an unmatched, ragged, clean pair of pajamas. He clutched them to his chest and walked, weaving, light-headed, to the bathroom to put them on. Delphine tightened his sheets and remade his bed. Fluffing his pillow, she felt a sharp object in the cheap feathers, reached in, and drew out the bundle of mementos from Ruthie, the notes, the clicker. Delphine began to examine these things, then realized they were private and stuffed them back. Marcus came in, slipped into the bed, shut his eyes against vertigo. "Drink this soup," said Delphine. The name signed on the bottom of the notes stuck in her heart. He must have loved Ruthie Chavers as only children love, to keep her notes hidden in his pillow. Delphine helped Marcus sit up and then tried to feed him a spoonful of soup from the pottery bowl she held. "I'm not a baby," said Marcus. He took the spoon from her hand, swallowed the soup in it, and held out his other hand for the bowl. He fed himself, slowly and carefully, sipping broth and holding each dumpling for a moment in his mouth, as though he was grateful for it, absorbing its taste. Watching him, Delphine breathed deeply, and then felt a quietness descend between them. The air was still, the sounds from the shop hushed and far away. The dog on the floor whined lightly in her dream. The spoon clinked against the side of the bowl. The boy carefully swallowed. Delphine felt as if this eating of the healing soup by the ill and hungry boy, and her watching of it, could go on, and she would not mind in the least. It was as though she were witnessing some sacrament. She was sorry when he put the bowl to his lips, drank the last drops, and handed back the spoon. She waved it in the air. More? With a sleepy, refusing nod, he gave her the bowl, too, and then slid down beneath the burst quilt. He closed his eyes with a great sigh of release. In moments he was breathing deeply. His fair skin flushed a delicate rose from ear to ear. His lashes were thick and faintly red, and his hair bristled pale against the tattered pillowcase. Delphine continued to sit in the chair, watching him, holding the empty bowl in her lap. She smoothed his hair back, but didn't dare kiss him or tuck the covers up tight around him until he was asleep. Walking out past some customers, Delphine overheard someone say that a bookkeeper's job had opened at the lumber yard. It would be pleasant to work in the scent of fresh sawdust rather than raw blood, she thought as she left. Roy was still not home when she returned. That was perhaps a good thing. She locked the door, doused the lights, and went to sleep. The next morning, she put on her work dress, a somewhat worn hat, and her old coat. She did not want to appear in her very best, those things Cyprian had bought for her, since it wouldn't look right. No matter what they might have heard at the lumber yard, she wanted to give the impression of an extremely respectable woman, but not one who could afford, say, a hat with a little green feather. A plain person, trustworthy, not a person who had a murderer for a best friend, or who'd lived with a vaudeville acrobat, or who had a gabby old souse for a father. Delphine, she wanted people to say of her. She's awfully quick, but she's solid and reliable. The spring wind was a quiet and sustained moan, fluttering bits of paper and driving down needles of sleet. The skies were pale purple, the trees soft gray, leafless. There was a watery freshness to the morning light. Delphine's mood lifted as she walked, for she had always loved this time of year, before the leaves came out, when the wind was wild. Clarice, in her dramatic way, had had the opposite reaction. She had always fallen into a perverse and severe mystery, and worn black to school, traced her eyes with the soot from a burnt match, and rouged her cheeks, sometimes with circles so she looked clownishly tubercular. To Delphine, the hesitation of March was cheering. March was all expectation, a gathering of power, still cold but marginally warmer every day, a hopeful time of the year. Walking down the nearly empty street, Delphine's thoughts turned calmly optimistic. And that was good, because when the creature stumbled toward her from the opposite direction, she was somehow prepared to deal with what she saw. Gray, naked, hairless, more ghostly animal than human, the wild shape flitted around the corner of the drugstore. Then it jumped from the alley, howling, and threw itself down, clutching at the frozen mud. In the hoarse call it made, she recognized her father. He clambered toward her on his knees, and then hopped up as if pulled by strings. He was blown against a storefront, like a ball of Russian thistle. He twirled off a front stoop to sprawl in the runnel of a rain gutter. Delphine ran for him. But he saw her, and with a start of horror stumbled backward, then turned and ran, streaking crazily back and forth across the street. His legs and arms were skinny and wasted, but his belly was round and frog-white. His genitalia were small purple decorations underneath. He didn't bother to hide them, or seem aware at all that he wasn't wearing a stitch. He just wanted to run. It didn't matter where. And he was quick and clever in delirium, Delphine knew. He was always very hard to catch. Delphine chased her father up the main street. Then he cut behind the Lutheran church. She chased him all the way around the building, hoping to trap him in the pastor's yard. Cutting through a patch of blazing forsythia, he nearly ran down Mrs. Orland Sorvin, who threw her round arms up and hollered for help. They left her bellowing cries behind. Roy leaped a primrose gate and sprinted over to the little town park by the river. There, he vaulted picnic tables, sped around the swings. Luckily, there were no children of an impressionable age, though a woman with a toddler hid its eyes and dropped her jaw wide. "He's harmless," called Delphine. Panting now, she chased Roy up the winding hill. Roy darted from there toward the fire station, then veered north, probably to climb the water tower. Delphine closed in. She had the youth, the stamina, but was hampered by her respectable job-seeking heels. When he eluded her, swinging around the gas pumps again on Main Street, weeping in terror at what his brain showed him, she reluctantly took off the shoes. She set them near the pump and then gave chase in stockinged feet, chagrined that her last pair would be ruined. Delphine tackled her father as he ran toward the town grade school. She bore him to earth, and then the gym teacher ran outside with a towel around his neck and sat on Roy, putting the towel down first. Roy's legs were streaked with filth and shit. Once caught, he was meek. Delphine took off her coat. She and the gym teacher threaded his arms into the coat's arms and buttoned it down the front. Children and teachers gaped at the scene from the windows as Roy swayed to his feet and let himself be led along, step by step, toward home. Once there, Delphine gave her father some water with sugar and salt sprinkled into it, put him to bed. She rolled him up in a sheet, and although he hated to be confined, she safety-pinned the sheet together and back and laid him on his side. She called Dr. Heach, who agreed to come and see him when he'd finished with his appointments. When she was sure that Roy was deeply asleep, she walked back to the lumberyard only to find that the job was filled this very morning. Very sorry. And could you make sure your father doesn't sleep again in the lumber piles? We're afraid he'll take a match to the pallets, build a fire. That's a hazard, you understand. If we were to take a nice, sharp carving knife and slice you open, said Dr. Heach, drawing a line with his finger up Roy's stomach to the breastbone from the groin. And if we were to push aside your stomach and your guts and take hold of your liver, say we ripped it out and showed you the poor, abused, pulsating organ, we would surely find you've done tremendous violence to it. Dr. Heach shook his lank silver curls, touched his eyebrows, almost whispered in his reverence for the liver. He went on talking to Roy in a gloomy, dreamy tone. This piteous, innocent, earnest helpmeet. What you've done is quite unforgivable, liquefied in places. Surely reeking. Here petrified. There pickled, just by gently palpating. With a faraway frown, Heach jammed his fingers into Roy's side and closed them on something deep in his midsection, causing Roy to yelp, then sob. I can tell this noble liver of yours is kaput. Leave it alone, groaned Roy, pushing the doctor's hands away. God knows I've tried. Dr. Heach huffed in disdain and turned to regard Delphine. I heard you ran a fast 50-yard dash this morning. It was more like 10 miles, said Delphine. Will he live? He defies all physical laws, said Heach, so I would be foolish to make a prediction. But I don't know how it is he keeps the flame burning in the wreckage as it is. Heach looked down at Roy. Suddenly, his assessing forbearance turned to rage, and he roared out, By God, you will live! I've put too much effort into your damn old carcass for you to die before you show consistent goodness to Delphine. He jabbed a finger at Roy's wasted face. You will not die now. It would be disrespectful. I won't allow it. Taper him off, he said to Delphine. I don't have to tell you how to do it. And give him this for the cough. He handed her a bottle of strong cherry-bright syrup. Then he put his hand on her shoulder for a moment and said to her, making sure Roy paid attention, When he does croak, bury him in a packing crate. Don't give him much of a funeral. Use the money on yourself. Not that people aren't kind, thought Delphine, but when they say no, do they mean because they really don't have work or because I'm me? She didn't know, just kept looking, and eventually, to her great relief, for she was down to the last $2 in her purse, she got a temporary job. Tensett Bean, the precise old man who sampled Sunshine cookies, who must have known she'd often given him an extra slice of bologna for his nickel, put in a good word for her. She was hired to file papers for the county offices in the courthouse. So her days became as dry as the wind outside. She worked in a back file room on an accumulation of boxes filled with old land settlements and myriad complaints. Nobody else really broke the tedium. One secretary took calls and worked up current papers on her smart black typewriter. Since she considered herself too important to be bothered by conversation with a file clerk, Delphine hardly ever addressed her, and after a while she could not remember the woman's name. Delphine rarely saw a county official in the flesh. They seemed busy doing county business somewhere else. It was a sleepy job. When she got home, she dosed Roy from the bottles of syrup and schnapps she carried with her and never left alone with him. Once he slept, his cough quieted. His breathing was so calm he didn't even snore. Delphine made herself dinner and went to sleep, too. Sleep fell over everything, monotonous and soft. Snowy fluff burst off the cottonwood trees and collected in the grass. Delphine moved slowly through the mild wind and hush of spring green, drugged with sleep like her father. She felt herself sinking away from the grind of life as she crept from her warm bed, through the astonishing light, to the dim rooms of dry paper where she worked. It was a kind of hibernation that she thought might last for the rest of her life. She grew fond of the boredom, the routine, and she wouldn't have given it up for just anyone at all. But there was Marcus, and behind him, or before him, she didn't know which, massive in the new wheat, stuffed with the strength of many, there was also Fidelis. It was usually Marcus's task to shred cabbage across the big wooden shredder, a thick paddle-shaped board inset with a sharp blade, easy to set over the wooden washtub that Fidelis used for mixing and fermenting his sauerkraut. He'd had Marcus shred the stuff for hours after school already, but after seeing how white his face was and how slowly he moved, even a month after Chicago, Fidelis had taken pity on the boy. He sent Marcus to bed. After supper, Fidelis finished the job. He took a cabbage head out of the crate and began to saw it lightly against the blade. Using just the right amount of pressure, he reduced it swiftly underneath his hand until there was only the thickness of a leaf between his palm and the metal. He tossed aside the leaf and took up a new, tightly packed whitish-green head, began on that, stopped halfway down, arrested by the sudden sensation of having recalled a tremendous task that he had left undone. That was his conviction of what oppressed him anyway. The problem was, he couldn't think what this task was at all. He picked up the cabbage again, but the impression in his mind only grew stronger. At length he was so severely haunted by it that he threw down his apron and went outdoors. There, in the spring-frosted meadow of the front yard, under a quarter moon that blazed in a fresh black sky, he remembered. It was not a task, but very definitely it was something he hadn't finished. The question was, he thought now, whether it ever could be finished. If he took it up again, would it go on forever? Also, did he have the courage? Did he dare go and see her? Delphine was reading and dozing over a thick Book of the Month Club novel she'd got from the little lending library run by some schoolteachers out of the courthouse basement. The plot was intimate, British, and safely romantic, one of those in which she had confidence she'd not be left for days with heartache. She'd always been a reader, especially since she lost Clarice. But now she was obsessed. Since her discovery of the book hoard downstairs from her job, she'd been caught up in one such collection of people and their doings after the next. She read Edith Wharton, Hemingway, Dos Passos, George Eliot, and for comfort Jane Austen. The pleasure of this sort of life, bookish she supposed it might be called, a reading life, had made her isolation into a rich and even subversive thing. She inhabited one consoling or horrifying persona after another. She read E.M. Forster, the Bronte sisters, John Steinbeck. That she kept her father drugged on his bed next to the kitchen stove. That she was childless and husbandless and poor meant less once she picked up a book. Her mistakes disappeared into it. She lived with an invented force. When she came to the end of a novel and put it down and with reluctance left its world, sometimes she thought of herself as a character in the book of her own life. She regarded the ins and outs, the possibilities and strangeness of her narrative. What would she do next? Leave town? Her father would die without her, a failed thread of plot. The lives of the Waldvogels would simply proceed on in the absence of her observation, without the question mark of her presence. A new story would develop. Delphine's story. Could she bear it? Maybe after all she'd live her story out right here. Something in her was changing as she read the books. Life after life flashed before her eyes, yet she stayed safe from misery. And the urge to act things out on stage could be satisfied cheaply, and at home, and without the annoyance of other members of an acting company. Her ambition to leave faded and a kind of contentment set in. She hadn't exactly feared the word contentment, but had always associated it with a vague sense of failure. To be discontented had always seemed much richer a thing. To be restless, striving, that view was romantic. In truth, she was finding out, life was better lived in a tranquil pattern. As long as she could read, she never tired of the design of her days. She did not mind living with poor, decrepit Roy, on the forsaken edge of a forgotten town, beneath a sky that punished or blessed at whim. Contentment. The word itself seemed square and solid in her mind as the little house, Roy's, that she thought of as her own house, her house at the end of the world. Horizon to all sides. You could see the soft, ancient line of it by stepping out the door. From the west, later and later every night, flame reflected up into the bursting clouds, skeins of fire, and the vast black fields. After she watched the sun go down, she lighted the lamps, picked up her latest book. Before she dove into the words, she sat and looked at the walls of her quiet room. This was her nightly ritual. She read. She dozed. She roused herself, refreshed and a little dizzy. She made herself a cup of strong tea and began again. Sometimes she read until 3 or 4 a.m., knowing that she could take a nap behind the file cabinet the next day. Several times a night she carefully looked around her, pleased at the details of her surroundings. The pinkish light from the expensive lamp that Ch.13 had inexplicably given to her glowed on the pale gold walls. Delphine had hung forest pictures cut from calendars and framed with scraps of birchwood. Gazing into those leafy prints, she entered a peaceful and now familiar state of suspension. A radio that Roy had acquired from Ch.13 and fixed played soothing, tinny orchestra music. There was no heater, but she had the quilt that Ava made for her draped up to her waist. Sometimes she traced the pinched little stitches that her friend had taken, and thought strangely that the stitches might as well have been taken in her own skin, and Ava pulling them. She was reminded of Ava many times a day. She still retained the imprint of her friend's personality, and in that way, another comfort, she liked to think she kept her alive. Ava would like this room, she thought. There was a small, ornate, feminine wooden desk where Delphine paid the bills. A huge padlocked sea trunk of bent blonde pine, secured with iron bands, held 2 more quilts used on very cold nights. A small oval rag rug gave warmth, she believed, to the center of the plain board floor. She hadn't decided whether the figurine of a dog, set on a rickety table pushed up underneath a window, was ugly or elegant. It didn't matter. All of these shabby objects were bathed in the kind light of the rose-shaded lamp. In that light, Delphine gazed upon them with a warm satisfaction and shut her ears to the cold, subterranean creaking of the earth. Yes, they were still down there, the Chavers. Not their bones, but some vestige of their desperation. Half asleep sometimes, Delphine talked to them, tried to explain. I didn't know. I wouldn't have. I am so sorry. Go away. When she heard someone knock on the door, she started and thought first of Ruthie, then contained herself. It was just that they never had visitors. Though the town was growing, few came out that way. Certainly no one ever at night. Delphine looked through the window before she opened the door and saw that Fidelis stood hunched into his woolen greatcoat. He was heavily scarved against the sharp spring wind and booted against the mud. For some reason he had walked. Delphine's heart leaped suddenly in worry for Marcus, and she lunged to open the door. Fidelis stepped in with a swirl of night air, and she swiftly shut the door behind him. "Marcus?" she asked. "Sleeping," said Fidelis, untying his heavy work boots. "He's not sick. Ist sehr müde." He left the boots behind him on some newspapers set near the door. "Dad's asleep in the kitchen," she explained. "So come, let's sit in here." Obediently, he walked in his wool-stockinged feet to the chair. The socks were gray, the heels and the toes bright red, childish-looking in a way that might have endeared Fidelis to Delphine, if she didn't pinch off such a thought before it formed. Without asking if he'd like some, she put the water on the stove for mint tea and came back to sit with him while she waited for it to boil. Fidelis told her there had been a letter from Germany. The boys had started school and were involved in a government youth group that Tante said was extremely hard to get selected for. She implied that she had had to use money that Fidelis sent with her to bribe government officials to admit the boys, though they had passed some rigorous tests. As for Tante, she had at first conducted sewing demonstrations with her American model machine. Then she'd realized it was inferior to the German model. "That's enough," said Delphine. "I'm not interested in your sister." She began to quiz him about the boys at home. Were they eating well, washing, and the business? Were the people he had credited paying their bills? Some, not enough. Were the suppliers giving him good prices? Obviously, from his answers, he did not have the time to spend with them in wangling better profit margins. Delphine frowned. 1 or 2% here and there will make or break us, she said. "You'll find out." She slapped the arm of her chair to hide her slip. Us? What was she saying? "Just tea again." She mocked his disappointed look and said, "You drink too much beer anyway." She rose and went into the kitchen, stepped around the sleeping Roy, and swirled mint leaves into the boiling water in her heavy brown teapot. She removed the cups from their shelves and put a lump of sugar in the bottom of each one. She brought the pot and the 2 cups, balanced, back into the living room and set them by the china figurine of the dog. "Have you ever seen a dog like this?" she asked Fidelis. It had long, floppy black ears, white and black markings, a pointed muzzle, and sat alertly upon a green porcelain cushion. Fidelis picked the dog up and turned it this way and that, almost playfully. "I don't think another like this dog exists on earth," he finally said, putting it back. Delphine said nothing. She was startled by the frivolous tone in his voice. There was an awkward, flirtatious quality about him. It was upsetting for her to hear him say anything that was not tied to the store. She addressed him on safer topics, and for a while they managed to skate a comfortable surface. Then Fidelis asked with no warning whether she knew, yet, if Cyprian was coming back. "No," said Delphine, her voice caught in reluctance to be thrown so suddenly into the personal. Fidelis leaned back now and looked directly at her. The rose light polished his features, lent to the whole of him an incongruous sweetness. He'd hung his jacket on the chair behind him and was now in his shirt sleeves. The light picked up the bronze of the hair on his forearms, and she gazed down a bit dizzily at his heavy-boned wrists. He glanced at the darkened door of the kitchen, hitched his chair a little closer to hers, leaned forward. "I gave Cyprian enough time," he said. His voice thudded. The statement seemed ridiculous. But when he leaned forward, Delphine smelled the spice of him. White pepper and red, a little ginger and caraway, and the male scent of him, the wool and the linen of his shirt, the tart shaving tonic. She knew he rubbed cigar ashes on his teeth to whiten them, and then brushed with baking soda. Knew he lathered his whiskers with Ava's old bars of hand-milled French lilac soap. All of these little things about him were hers to know because she'd kept his house while his wife died. Then she'd cared for his sons. She told herself all along that these things had nothing to do with him, Fidelis himself. But now, here he was, removed from the intimacy of his family. And yet she knew his habits, while he'd hardly seen the inside of her house. He knew little of her, nothing so personal as the type of soap she used. And what was she to make of this giving Cyprian time? Gave him? What do you mean, gave him? "Time," said Fidelis, "to come back." "Well, yes," said Delphine. His meaning dawned on her. A contrary ticklish energy seized her. She wanted to make things difficult for Fidelis. Why not? Why should he come here so easily and overfill the small pale gold room, her private nest? So she began to laugh as though he'd said something very funny, and then she calmed herself and took a drink of her tea. "Did you think he had deserted me?" She would never give away the reason they had parted. She would never tell that he'd left much earlier than people thought. So like a man to think that. Perhaps she was a little under the influence of one of her drawing-room novels, in which people sparred over such topics as love. For it delighted her suddenly to be in the position she was in, to have Fidelis here trying to explain himself, and her believing that she finally read his heart. So he had waited for her. Fidelis. She shook her head. The curls of her brown hair lashed her shoulders, and she raised her eyes to his with a lazy knowledge. But when she looked into his face, his expression was of such helpless ardor that she forgot her small artifice. It would seem for months afterward that there had been a great collision. The two glaciers had through slow forest smashed together at last and buckled. The two were dazed, a bit slow with other people, forgetful. Delphine kept her job at the courthouse, but cut the hours back and came into the shop to wait on customers each afternoon. She came to be near Fidelis. As before, she tended the kitchen, and if she had time, did laundry for the boys, not Fidelis. Since she'd left, he'd begun to iron his own shirts with a soldierly precision. One afternoon, she found him at it when she arrived. That day, for some reason, the whole place was quiet. She walked into the cold, concrete-floored utility room, where the water was piped out of the wall into a double soapstone tub. There he stood, chilled in the loop of his undershirt, arms moving above the wooden board covered with a padded cloth. He had bought a modern plug-in iron, and was putting a crease in the starched, sizzling shoulder of a sleeve. To watch him in his power doing work women did so often filled Delphine with a low electricity, and she brushed the side of his arm above his elbow. Her hand was still in its glove. He put the iron down, took her hand in his hand, and then pulled off each finger of her glove, while looking into her eyes with a steady gravity. When the glove was off, he lifted her hand in both of his and regarded it intently. He stroked her knuckles, scored with white scars, and at last, tentatively, brought her hand to his lips. He fit his mouth over the crease where her fingers came together at the palm. Then he moved too quickly, in a way she didn't like, with an arrogant sweep, and tried to pull her to him. She sidestepped his rough gesture and walked out of the room. still breathing the heady, scorched scent of clean ironing. That was the first time they'd ever touched, or kissed, though it was more than a kiss and not yet a kiss. Walking home later on, she thought of his eyes as he pulled her glove off, and then she was suddenly home. She realized that she'd walked, tranced, down the long road without seeing a thing around her. She had no memory of how she got to her door, and yet, though she couldn't stop thinking of him in this new way, she avoided him. For when they were around each other now, the stage was bare, all the scenery pulled away, and there was only the full burden of their attraction. It was too much to let it happen all at once. They came together by the smallest incremental movements. Weeks later they still hadn't kissed, hadn't let their mouths touch, and yet one day in the dusty office filled with paperwork, Fidelis knelt before Delphine, and with his hands smoothed the insides of her legs up to the tops of her heavy silk stockings, felt where they were hooked with metal garters, traced the slices of material up underneath her skirt. He spread her legs apart so wide she was embarrassed, there in the leather chair, and then he kissed the insides of her knees. She caught his hair back in both fists, pulled so hard it must have stung, but only stared down at him, his face immobile between her legs. She shoved him away with all of her strength and pressed down her skirt. "Jesus Christ," she said, "what are you thinking?" "I don't know." He rose in one subdued, brutal motion and dusted himself off with broad, unnecessary whacks at the legs of his pants. "Around you I get these ideas." He tried to recover his dignity, folded his arms, then unfolded them, sat down and rifled the desk for a cigarette. When he couldn't find one, he threw up his hands as though to say, "See, I can't get anything I want," and Delphine finally laughed. Many days they couldn't bear the tension and ignored each other entirely. They set a date 4 months away on which they would be married. At first it seemed a very long time to wait, and then it seemed to Delphine far too short a time, and she thought maybe she would put it off. Fidelis bought their wedding license in the courthouse, showed her the paper casually, and they both signed their names with a dispassionate alacrity, as though they were signing banking documents. They were good at working together, quick and respectful and efficient. Delphine took over the bookkeeping and the ordering again, and she began to bring religion to the dusty office, careening with papers. One afternoon, when Franz and Marcus were eating in the kitchen, Delphine brought Fidelis in and pushed at his shoulder. "Tell them," she commanded. Franz paused, frozen, his hand to his mouth, waiting for his father's announcement. Marcus continued eating, chewing serenely, nodding. He said, "I already know what you're going to say." He took another bite and asked the next important question. "So does that mean Emil and Eric are coming home?" "I wrote and sent money," said Fidelis with assurance. "Tanta will make the arrangements." "Tell them," said Delphine, again shaking his arm. Fidelis gathered himself, but before he could open his mouth, Franz beat him. "Oh, I get it," said Franz. "You two are getting married." He forked half of a baked apple into his mouth, chewed it all up. "And as long as we're making announcements, I'm going into the Air Corps. I'm enlisting." "There is no war." Fidelis's low voice nearly cracked with intensity. He still had his hopes, but Franz didn't seem to notice. "Oh, there will be," said Franz. "Just you wait. I see it coming, and when it comes, I'm—" He made a skimming motion with his hand, like an airplane taking off. He buzzed his hand into the wild blue yonder, and then he grinned at them all, nodding to encourage their approval. Fidelis hunched his shoulders in distress and left the room. "Do you have to be so happy about it?" said Delphine, annoyed with Franz for spoiling the announcement, but also suddenly aghast at his thirst for war. "I'm happy about it," said Marcus. "It's like you already live here." "Oh, that," Franz said. "He can do what he wants." "You know what I'm talking about," said Delphine. "Can you go and sit with him at least?" "Dad wouldn't want that." Franz took a walnut from the bowl on the table, cracked it with his fingers, just like Fidelis. He tossed the meats up in the air and caught them on his tongue. "I'll fly a Spitfire. We won't get anywhere near German territory. I'll be fighting other pilots, not Dad's people. He knows that." "You have no idea what a war means." Delphine tried not to raise her voice or drive him off, but his willful ignorance was making her passionate. "Forget that I'm marrying your father. Be realistic, Franz. They could put you in the infantry." "Me?" He looked incredulous, pityingly at Delphine. "A bomber, maybe, but no, I'll be a fighter pilot." He made noises with his mouth and pretended to machine-gun Marcus, who popped his lips back at him. "God, you're a hard soul," Delphine cried, overcome. "What do you want? The marriage is your business," said Franz. He sulked. "Doesn't matter what I think." "Of course it matters," said Delphine coaxingly. "Well then, I think I'm leaving," said Franz. "Don't take this personal, but I don't want to think about it." He got up and sauntered away, shoved his fists in the pockets of his poor, tattered imitation flight jacket. As he passed out of Delphine's sight, he swore hard, kicked the dust, his eyes watered. Then he laughed sarcastically at himself. He had never been so miserable in his life. Whenever Franz passed the place where he and Mazarine had swung from the road to enter their special place underneath the pine, his throat burned. A tension collected around his heart. For hours after, he would think about the pine tree, his ribs tightening and his chest shutting out the air. It was hard to take a breath. And yet suddenly his breath came out in huge, deep, surprising sighs. Food went dry in his throat, and the weight dropped off him. The bones of his wrists jutted out. His cheekbones sharpened. Nor could he sleep right. His dreams were of reckless bargains. Torrents of water swept him from Mazarine, or tumbled her over cliffs and through culverts, just out of reach. Things had only gotten worse as it became apparent that Mazarine Shimmick truly meant her no, and would not have him back. Mazarine, in the new clothing he had never touched. She wore a soft plaid kilt of rust brown to school now. Even Franz could tell that it was perfectly sewn. The hem swished just the right way around her legs when she walked, whirled softly when she turned. The colors of her pleated skirt were the browns and golds of the light that used to fall upon the two of them underneath the great pine tree. She wore crisp blouses that managed somehow to drape as well across her bird's collarbone. The fabric joined across her chest with rich, glazed mother-of-pearl buttons. She wore her hair in a braid now, twined through with a ribbon of heavy satin, sometimes blue, sometimes yellow. He could not help recording a list of these details. They were all he had of her right now. But Mazarine didn't in any way return his regard. She didn't speak to him, much less let him take her books from her arms and strap them onto her bicycle and give her rides, as though she were a much younger girl. He missed that the most, he thought. Even more than touching her, he longed for the weight of her wobbling between his arms on the bicycle, him steering, and her laughing as she tried to balance. The farther away she kept herself, the more he knew this. He loved Mazarine. To the death, he thought wildly, beyond death. How stupid. He crashed his fists on his temples. At night, he thought of and rejected ways to make it up to her, ways to draw her to him. He would throw himself upon her mercy, waylay her, beg her, buy her a hothouse rose and lay it on her bed at night. She needed him, didn't she? Anyone could tell she was unhappy. Look how quiet she was, walking the school hallways, how serious. Look how her slender grace had become an alarming thinness, how she kept her hair, which had always swirled with her movements, stiffly locked into that one thick braid. The only thing that really diverted him was the airfield. Sometimes Franz looked at the other men who worked around him and wondered if they'd ever had such feelings. He doubted it. None of them looked as if they could ever have been in love with anything but their machines. At first, he scorned such limitations. Then, they made sense to him. To actually fix a touchy engine was a relief. So whenever Fidelis let him out of the shop, Franz worked on airplanes. In payment, Pouty Mannheim began to teach him how to fly. Each time they went up, Franz felt the same roaring physical release from the earth that had charmed him when he first watched, from the field behind the house, the plane take off and lift over the windbreak. Only it was better to be in the plane itself. Better now, as he understood exactly how to control the flight, read the wind, the signs in the clouds, small and large. On their 8th flight, Pouty let him have a chance at the controls. For weeks, they practiced taking off, touching down, and then gradually added a beginning barnstormer's repertoire of stalls, spins, easy wing-overs, and gentle loops. When Pouty finally let him take the plane up solo, Franz experienced a startling lightness. The plane flew at a touchy and thrilling balance with just him in it. He focused on the town grain elevator, a thin mark on the horizon, kept his nose directed at it, and did a slow point roll. Then a more complicated hesitation roll, a loop, a difficult spin. The earth tipped over him. Concentrate or die. Things were simple upside down. By the time he landed, he was absolutely at peace. After that, he thought that maybe he would survive the loss of Mazarine if only he could spend his life up in the air. No guests, no cake, no flowers. After she married Fidelis and Franz left to start his tests for the Air Corps, Delphine continued to divide her time between the butcher shop and her house, nursing Roy. She kept part of her filing job, kept reading her books, tried to keep as much of her old routine as she could. Still, the past with its horrors, complexities, and incompletions intruded. Although she was married, the background to her new life seemed unfinished, like a jumbled stage set. She wished that she could file her past the way she filed the papers at the courthouse. Then Cyprian returned. He was sitting on the front steps of Delphine's house one early evening, wearing a hat. He squinted out at the road and nodded, cool and self-contained, as Delphine drove the car into the yard. Then he took off the hat, and Delphine saw that he was utterly bald. He looked even more attractive, exotic, like someone from a prehistoric world jolted into pants and shirt and shoes. The head made you think of him naked. Her heart beat hard when she saw him. She took a deep, ragged breath to calm herself as she stopped the car and took in his presence through the windshield. So here he was. She smiled, an involuntary reflex, before she thought of Clarice, then realized that she could find out what happened to Clarice. The smile altered but stayed on her face. In spite of everything, she was glad to see Cyprian. As she opened the driver's door, jumped out and nearly ran toward him, Delphine was surprised to experience a sudden, uncomfortable pang. Was Fidelis watching? Irrationally, she glanced to all sides. She tried to shrug the discomfort off her shoulders like a cape, but her uneasiness persisted. Her greeting was tentative, and she stood before Cyprian in the bent sun of early dusk, shifting her weight, hoping he'd not come into the house with her. Again, this sense that she was doing something wrong, although there was no wrong in it. But there was the intimidating certainty of Fidelis. The realization that she was now susceptible to a man's jealousy irritated her. From under the porch in the stillness of the grass, mosquitoes started to whine. Cyprian tipped his head to the side and fanned away the bugs with his hat. They sat down on the porch steps. "Light up a cigarette, will you, to keep off the bloodsuckers?" She accepted a cigarette from Cyprian and allowed it to burn down between her fingers. "I'm not even going to talk to you," she said in a low voice, finally, "until you tell me what happened to Clarice." "I didn't know about Hawk," Cyprian offered. "I know what the hell happened to Hawk. I asked you what happened to her. All she said to me was this: 'I'll go where my work is necessary and appreciated.'" "That actually sounds like her," said Delphine. "I'll bet she went south. New Orleans. No, farther. The Yucatan, or maybe even farther down. Brazil. I can see it." She sighed and shook herself. She couldn't see it. Missing Clarice was still a daily habit, like drinking coffee or turning on the radio. She didn't stop to ache or wonder or brood over Clarice anymore. She just missed her and then was done with it and went on to the next thing. And that is the kindness of time, she thought. She looked at Cyprian. "So you didn't know about Hawk until when?" "Till she told me." "Which was when?" "Well, right away, on the trip to Minneapolis." "Didn't it occur to you then that somebody might connect the two of you? Think you were in on it?" "For sure it did," said Cyprian, "which is one of the reasons I parted ways with her." "Why'd you come back here?" Cyprian turned his hat around and around in his hands. It was a smooth, clay-brown fedora with a wide, brown, grosgrain band. Expensive looking. He pinched the brim, his fingers careful, choosing his words. "I'm passing through," he said finally, "but I just had to see if you love him." "Of course I do." "The hell you do." Suddenly they turned, their eyes locked in outrage, and they stared at each other. Their exasperation was so exactly matched that it struck them both, at the same time, as ludicrous. They turned away, each unwilling to let the other see any softening or smile. Delphine fiddled with the cigarette, sharpening its ash on the wood of the steps, waving it slowly around her to make a smoke barrier. "So you came back, not knowing if you'd get picked up for murder, just to see if I love Fidelis." Cyprian didn't answer for a moment. Then he nicked his head. "Like I said, I have other reasons." He shrugged and raised his eyebrows. His eyes were sharply lovely. "Come in, then," she said at last. "Roy's in bed. He needs a good laugh." Cyprian jammed his hat on his head, then took it off and followed her across the bare porch and into the house. Inside, he took off his hat and held it over his stomach as he walked into the kitchen, where Roy slept. Cyprian sat down by the bed and waited for Roy to wake. For a long time, Roy lay still, hands on the quilt, eyes shut. Eventually, he opened one eye just a crack, took in Cyprian's presence, then shut his eyes again with an elaborate fluttering of lids. Delphine was surprised to find that she was cheered to see this deception, this hint of the old Roy, and she pulled up her chair, too. "Hey, Dad," she said softly, "you've a visitor." Roy lay mum, deciding whether to retreat from consciousness or seek out communion with the living. His brows knit, and he worked his jaws in little chewing motions. Finally, he gave a decisive jerk and let his eyelids flap up to display great, staring, milky blue rounds of iris. "Cyprian! Cyprian the Bald!" Cyprian grasped Roy's bony, spectral, age-freckled hand. Once he'd decided to join the living, Roy became energized by possibilities. "Oh, for a beer!" he cried. "A little sip of schnapps. Could you see your way clear to wet my whistle?" "Dad?" Yes, assuredly, I know there is compelling evidence that it might kill me." Roy made brushing motions in the air as if swiping off the warnings. "But a very tiny amount might actually be beneficial. Serve as an inoculation, if you will." "We're down to a teaspoon or two every few hours," said Delphine. "I guess it wouldn't hurt to have your teaspoon." "Now we're talking," crowed Roy. He patted Cyprian's arm. "Would you care to join me? Give this man a teaspoon." Roy swept his arm grandly toward the little cutlery drawer. "He can have a glass, Dad." She unclipped a set of keys from her belt, took a glass outside to the car. She unlocked the trunk and then used another key to unlock a toolbox padlocked into the trunk. From the box, she removed a pint bottle of brandy. She poured the glass half full, set the glass on the roof of the car, locked everything back up, and brought the glass of brandy back to Roy's bedside. She poured a bit of the glass into a bottle cap and dipped in a teaspoon. "Salut!" Roy opened his mouth and then closed it around the spoon. Cyprian nicked his glass at the old man. "What are you up to now?" Roy's tone was convivial, but his eyes glittered full of sudden tears. "Are you casting around for a job and looking for a wife? Did you come here as a dog returns to a place it's once been fed?" Cyprian took a large swallow of the brandy, and Roy went on speculating. "There's always farm work around here, of course, but that is both brutal and seasonal. I speak from much experience. Now, there's our thriving main street, all those shops lined up raking in cash. Clerking. Or perhaps you could learn to barber. Only Myra's getting old. His pole needs painting. Ha! Ha! His pole needs painting. My pole," he nudged Cyprian, "hasn't been painted for the last 26 years. What about yours?" Cyprian looked at Delphine. She raised her eyebrows but kept her face impassive. "Oh, the paint's fresh on mine," said Cyprian. "What do you hear from the rest of the club?" "Mannheim is still aloft," said Roy, "and Fidelis married the woman you skipped out on, that is." He nodded at Delphine with affection. "Her royal obstinacy. Once again, she has nursed me back from the brink of the abyss. I'd flung myself headlong into the drink, you know, and made of myself something of an embarrassment to her. Still, she loves her old dad. She tapered me off. How about that second teaspoon?" "Live it up," said Delphine. Roy closed his eyes and opened his mouth. She put the spoon in. "I didn't run out on her," said Cyprian, giving Delphine a meaningful look. "I offered her an engagement ring, a real nice one. She turned me down." "Watch out," said Delphine. "I know all about where that ring ended up." "Ah!" gasped Roy. He had taken the spoon from Delphine's fingers and was sucking on it like a happy child. "The disappointments of love lie heavier each year. Time does not, as the philosopher's wishful thinking goes, time does not heal all wounds. When I fell hard," said Roy proudly. "I fell through the center of the world." "You've milked your love martyrdom far enough," said Delphine. "I'm tired of it. She was my mother, you know. I'm the one who really got the raw deal here and ended up taking care of you, you booze hound, all of these years." "And hasn't it been a grand old time?" cried Roy. He was always encouraged and cheered when Delphine joined him in his bantering. "I believe that the sacred love I have borne these many years is a love that has sucked me straight into the vortex, the omphalos of the universe. And there I have seen such things, my friends, such things." Roy let his voice trail off and his gaze unfocus, as though he were reliving a vision. "Mostly, though," he shook his head, jolting back, "I have seen a lot of hooch disappear." "Dad's mistaken the navel of the universe," said Delphine, "for the dimple at the bottom of the schnapps bottle." "Well, be that as it may, I am actually here," said Cyprian, with an air of setting things right at last, "to play an engagement." "Oh, what?" Roy's mouth dropped in delight. "That's right," said Cyprian. "I'm not really looking for a job. I'm part of the Lyceum series. I travel with the Snake Man now." He reached into his pocket and drew out a roll of pink cardboard tickets. "How many would you like?" "The Snake Man?" said Delphine, a little wounded somehow, maybe even a bit jealous. You could have written. Does he double as your human table? It didn't have the same effect, said Cyprian, with 2 men. Though we did work out a few other balancing tricks. He owns his own python, brings it on stage in a leather case on wheels. He's got an assortment of reptiles, Cyprian paused, and 1 arachnid. What's his name? Said Delphine. Mighty Tom. How a good name for a performer. No, that's the spider. My partner's name is Wilhus Gast. So that, thought Delphine, was that. Well, what's he like? She asked. Well, he's a lot like me, said Cyprian. A performer, you know. He made it over here from Lithuania, and he's a Jew. I was a real curiosity to him at first. I took him home with me. Cyprian laughed. Boy, was he surprised. How come? Well, there's no Jews on the reservation, to speak of. I never knew one when I was growing up, any more than he'd know an Indian. Except he did know about us, and said he believed we were one of the lost tribes of Israel, doomed to wander, too, like his people. Always to be on the edge of things, hunted and hounded, he said. Well, okay, I said, so let's roam around together. So we got this act up, and since then, we've been playing it steady. Delphine and Marcus arrived early at the school gymnasium the next night,